Hello and welcome to lecture number 5. Today we'll talk about the progressive movement. There are a few themes to be addressed in this presentation. First of all, we'll define what's meant by the progressive movement. Just to let you know, it was a political reform movement. Next, we'll address some of the leaders at the state and national level. We'll also explore some of their accomplishments. One of the things you want to be thinking about is how you might evaluate the accomplishments and try to determine which you think was the most important. Let's start by exploring some background to the progressive movement. So just real quickly, the progressive movement took place beginning in the 1890s up until about 1917, and it was a political reform movement attempting to resolve many of the problems dealing with American society during this era, particularly as a result of the rapid rise of industrialization. And on the right, we see an image of one of its leaders, President Theodore Roosevelt. Historians have generally identified three so-called wings to the progressive movement. One wing, or one group, focused on social justice. Their goal was to try to improve living and working conditions for average people, particularly immigrants. Secondly, there was a focus on democracy. Their goal was to try to eliminate corruption in politics and to try to address and involve more people in the political process to expand democratic values. Lastly, there was a so-called anti-monopoly wing. There were lots of businesses that had monopolies in different industries. There was a concern that the growth of these large businesses was hurting the American people, so the government should do something to protect people's rights. One common denominator to this movement were a group of journalists nicknamed muckrakers. Their goal was to try to expose many of the problems in American society so that average people, as well as political leaders, could try to make amends and fix those problems. One famous muckraker was Lincoln Steffens. He wrote for a magazine called McClure's that investigated a range of different areas. One focus of Steffens was the corruption in American cities and in politics. Ida Tarbell wrote a scathing history of Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller, which was highly critical of the oil giant. We'll talk in more detail about Upton Sinclair a little bit later in the presentation. There were progressive leaders at both the state and national level. We'll focus on those local leaders next. The image here shows Jane Addams. She was the daughter of a successful Illinois business leader. Eventually, she became concerned about many of the problems faced by the poor and immigrants, many of those people who were working in really poor conditions, and their living conditions were poor as well. Eventually, she established Hull House. Here we see an image of Hull House. After she had graduated from college, she took a tour of Europe and she saw Toynbee House, which was kind of like a settlement house in England. And so she wanted to pattern Hull House after Toynbee House in Europe. Social workers, such as Addams, lived in the house themselves and worked with immigrants on a daily basis. Addams turned Hull House into a social center for recent immigrants and many of the poor. She designed art projects, English lessons, as well as classes in cooking and civics. Ultimately, her goal was to try to improve the filthy and overcrowding conditions that were common for people in inner cities. Eventually, she became a pioneer social worker, maybe one of the first in the United States. While she began Hull House in the years after the Civil War, by the 1890s, there were 50 similar organizations nationwide. Possibly the best-known progressive reformer at the state level is shown here. Robert La Follette. At one point, he was a U.S. Senator, and he also served as governor of Wisconsin. He was determined to provide an alternative to the dominance of traditional party politics. Eventually, his set of programs became known as the Wisconsin Idea because he regularly met with experts to try to improve society, and those experts were often from the University of Wisconsin, members of the economics faculty, political faculty, things like that. He had three main goals. First of all, he advocated for the conservation of natural resources so they could be used in the long term. He also promoted more democracy and the direct election of United States senators. Finally, he supported an income tax on corporations and inherited fortunes. Why in the world would La Follette support an income tax? Well, there had been no tax on people's incomes as well as on businesses, and he argued that wealthy people didn't pay their fair share, like Harry Sinclair, who had a fortune in the oil industry, who only paid $213 in income tax. The people who actually did pay a lot in taxes were people who owned property, like farmers, who were unfairly bearing the brunt of the taxation in the United States. He wanted to make a fairer system. There were several accomplishments at the state level in many different states. For example, by the 19-teens, at least 30 states had limitations and even outlawed aspects of child labor. And then in over 20 states, with Michigan leading the country, there were a range of laws making employers liable for employees who may have been injured or who died while on the job. So this was an example of the progressive movement encouraging the government to take steps to protect citizens in the United States. Next, we'll explore a progressive president and his impact on the political system. Theodore Roosevelt was the first progressive president. He became famous nationally for his exploits during the Spanish-American War. He eventually was elected to the vice presidency, but then William McKinley was assassinated. So Roosevelt took over as president following his assassination. Theodore Roosevelt had an interesting background. He grew up in an incredibly wealthy family in New York, yet he also had his share of tragedy. At one point, he was really interested in becoming a cowboy, and he lived out west. However, part of his motivation for doing this is because of the tragedy of his wife's death. In 1884, Roosevelt was out and he received a telegram announcing that his daughter had been born, and he was elated. Then 2 days later, he received another, and he learned that his wife was on her deathbed, and his mother also was near death. He eventually made it home, but his mother and wife died within a very short time after the birth of his first child. On the right, we see his diary entry for that day, Valentine's Day in 1884. Roosevelt dealt with his grief by immersing himself in work, and he went out west and he lived as a cowboy for a time. Eventually, he became involved in politics, and one of the ways that he influenced the political system was to expand the power of the presidency. One way that he influenced the presidency dealt with a strike of mining workers in 1902. The United Mine Workers had a range of employees who worked in the mines in the American West. They worked under horrible conditions that often led to injuries as well as to deaths. So they struck. They wanted to have an increase in their wages and hours as well as recognition of their union. However, the mine owners refused to even meet with leaders of the local unions. Roosevelt knew that the mining industry was important to the U.S. economy, so he actually stepped in and mediated talks between the two groups. Eventually, a settlement was reached. While the strikers didn't achieve all of their goals, there were only some minor concessions when it came to wages. Roosevelt was important because he ensured that labor had the right to organize, and he defended that right. And so this was an important step toward laborers gaining more power. Another example of Roosevelt's impact was seen with the Northern Securities case. This dealt with the issue of trusts or monopolies that had a huge impact on the U.S. economy. The Northern Securities Company was controlled by the financier J.P. Morgan, and it held a virtual monopoly over the railroads in the Northwest. Roosevelt did not think that this was positive for the country, so he had his Attorney General go after the company. Eventually, through the courts. In 1904, the Supreme Court ordered the company be dissolved. Roosevelt's actions in this case, in order to break up this huge company, were important because they earned him the reputation as a trust buster. Remember I mentioned The Jungle earlier in this presentation? Well, this was a work of fiction written by Upton Sinclair, who was a muckraker. He spent several weeks in the area of Chicago investigating conditions, working conditions as well as living conditions, and he chronicled the problems with the meatpacking industry in the United States. Here is a selection from The Jungle. There was potted game and potted grouse, potted ham and deviled ham. Deviled, as the men called it. Deviled ham was made out of the waste ends of smoked beef, and also tripe dyed with chemicals so that it would not show white. And finally, the hard cartilaginous gullets of beef, but after the tongues had been cut out. All this ingenious mixture was ground up and flavored with spices to make it taste like something. Another section described the storage of meat. A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. The rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them, and then they would die. And then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. Doesn't sound so good, does it? The book described many instances like this, whether they were working conditions or living conditions, particularly with the focus on immigrant families. This caused a firestorm, and it became an instant bestseller nationwide. Theodore Roosevelt read those passages from The Jungle, and he had the government investigate to see if they were accurate. When he learned that they were accurate, he later called for legislation to protect American consumers. As a result of those investigations and the publication of The Jungle, Congress passed what's come to be known as the Pure Food and Drug Act. This required businesses to include a list of ingredients on the labels for their products. Next, it also established sanitary requirements. If you wanted to produce meat, you had to meet certain requirements. And it included enforcement power, as it allowed for money for inspectors in order to enforce these regulations. Roosevelt was not the only progressive president. We'll look at some others next. Two progressive presidents followed Theodore Roosevelt into the White House. On the left, we see Woodrow Wilson, and on the right, there's William Howard Taft. Taft was actually Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. While the two of them had some conflict after a while, one thing that's important is that under the Taft administration, far more trusts were busted than under Roosevelt's. Woodrow Wilson was president from 1913 to 21. He had been a college professor, then he was the governor of New Jersey, and several so-called progressive amendments were passed during his administration. Let's look in more detail at these amendments to the Constitution. We see the influence of La Follette's Wisconsin idea with the passage of the 16th Amendment in 1913. This allowed Congress to establish a tax on people's incomes. You can see some of the other figures there as well. On the right, there's a headline from the Ludington Daily News. Further influence of La Follette's ideas are seen with the 17th Amendment. This allowed for the direct election of United States senators by individual voters within each state. Under the old system, each state's legislature chose the 2 senators. This allowed for more democracy in the United States. Another progressive amendment expanding democracy was seen with the 19th Amendment, which became part of the Constitution in 1919. The 19th Amendment dealt with women's suffrage, or, in other words, women's right to vote. Notice this map. The green states identified on this map were states where women had full voting rights prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment. Notice there are only 2 east of the Mississippi River: New York, as well as Michigan. The brown states on this map did not allow for any voting by women. There was extended debate over whether or not women should be allowed the right to vote. Critics believed that a woman's place was in the home, not involved with politics. During World War I, supporters of women's suffrage gained momentum. The focus of the 19th Amendment is pretty easy to remember. Essentially, it guaranteed that all women, adult women, had the right to vote. Momentum for the progressive movement actually slowed after the United States became involved in World War I, beginning in 1917. Although many of the ideas included in the progressive movement did continue in later years, for the most part, the movement did largely come to an end in 1917. Let's finish with a quick review of the main ideas included in the presentation. This presentation has tried to address the progressive movement. It was a political reform movement attempting to resolve many of the problems facing the United States in the early 1900s. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to identify many of those successes and then evaluate which do you believe to be the most important accomplishment. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new, and you'll see some of the sources for this presentation in the next few slides.